Hi friends, so this week we're taking chapters 7 and 8 together of Johnson's Ask the Beast in order to round out that section on creation before we consider human beings as particular creatures embedded within creation. And this week Johnson acknowledges a fact that we've been hinting at throughout the previous chapters. She writes, "The natural world is not just a beautiful dwelling place of the Creator Spirit, whose love empowers creation to evolve according to its own free, rigorous processes. It is also a place of agony, insofar as these processes exact a high price." So suffering and pain, predation and extinction, these are all part of the evolutionary process that reinforces the point that we're participating in life. But life, as Paul acknowledges, is yet unfinished. And Johnson says, quote, "To round out the exploration of continuous creation, this chapter links the Creator Spirit, present and active in the world, with the love of God, made known in the death and resurrection of Christ, beginning with the groaning and then moving towards hope." So it's true that pain actually has an evolutionary function. It conditions the awareness, it triggers the flight and the emotional responses of avoidance, and we see sorrow in animals with more developed neocortexes. Elephants, perhaps most famously, which Holmes Ralston calls the shadow of sentience. General reproduction, aging, death is a passing on of traits and behaviors without which there would be no evolutionary development or adaptation. Without that, life would cease. Even with natural extinctions, they open up new niches for new life to develop. So death, and even pain, is concomitant with the biological condition of life. To live is to negotiate space and resources, etc. So consciousness, pain, sorrow, this is an inevitable part of our glory because we know and we feel. To want to live outside of that created condition is actually part of our state of sin. And this is one of the root reasons that commodification destroys life, because not only does it instrumentalize creatures, but it attempts to mitigate all risk, and that is to try to slip the creaturely bonds of our inherent nature. So pain and suffering have its place in our natural condition. But what about this cruel case of the pelican chick that Johnson highlights? Well, Ralston says that part of the problem is that pain is normally seen from the perspective of the local or individual self, and therein lies the problem. To answer that problem, Johnson says most either turn to theodicy, which is to try to rationally defend God as good in the face of pain, or to moralize pain as sin, or the effects of sin. And so to deal with this, she finds in Moltmann a solution. Social pain and suffering, which can also be ecological, are evil, but natural mortality is part of our holiness and our participation. It's part of the free process of life, which, like free will, is part of the creative, generative nature of a free, life-giving creation. So just as free will and chance leave us vulnerable to pain, the free process of life is sometimes not aligned to the individual life itself. But isn't that okay? Because we live on this side of the eschaton. We're groaning for redemption as part of creation. And Johnson takes a long look at the theological view of redemption, specifically God's presence in the death and resurrection of Christ. She writes, and this is a quote, "The indwelling, empowering Creator Spirit abides amid the agony and the loss. God, who is love, is there in solidarity with the creatures, shot through with pain and finished by death. There, in the God-forsaken moment, as only the giver of life can be, with the promise of something more. A rich source for this idea lies in the prophetic understanding of the Holy One of Israel as a God of immense pathos who freely relates to the world in delight and anguish. End quote. That pathos, that emotion, that feeling, that ability to be moved is most fully revealed in Easter, which is not just an act by divine fiat or God's will, but it's a participation in the real, actual, physical transforming of pain and suffering into a glory, a living glory, that's something beyond what we can imagine about a world without pain. So here Johnson introduces Gregerson's phrase, deep incarnation. And it's about the Word taking on sarx, the stuff of creation. Incarnation is not just God experiencing the human condition in order to redeem humanity, that is the human condition, but taking on the condition of creation in order to redeem the oikoumene, the whole inhabited earth. So Rahner writes that this anthropocentric interpretation of the incarnation is actually a weak Christology. He writes, this error results, Rahner believes, from assuming that divine nearness is so overwhelming that it will swallow up or at least diminish what is created and finite, whereas precisely the opposite is the case. The non-competitive model of relationship between God, who is love, and the world that we have already traced is operative also in the incarnation. Given that nearness to God and genuine human autonomy grow in direct and not inverse proportion, Jesus is genuinely human in virtue of existing as God's own self-expression in time, not despite this. That's a quote from page 197. So, friends, this is non-violence par excellence in the face of pain and suffering in the world. Union, God's union with the flesh, and our participation in the life of the Trinity, that respects the absolute freedom of God to be God in God's truest, loving, non-violent nature, without trying to crowbar God into some rational philosophy, trying to explain how God is good in the face of pain and suffering. Deep incarnation is a revelation and a proclamation of a good news that is really, truly for all creation. This is Sally McFaig, as she agrees that this concept illuminates what the ministry of Jesus really was all about. She writes that this is the real Christic paradigm. In a word, the liberating, healing, and inclusive love is the meaning of it all. See, this is not anachronistically eisegeting an ecological understanding back into what Christ said, but recognizing that this good news of compassionate, extravagant, life-giving love was always meant for the entire creation in its redemption. So in thinking about the concept of suffering as we experience it in creation, we need to distinguish between natural and sinful causes of pain. Again, the cross is the result of an abuse of power, as in human domination of creation, not pain associated with the natural processes like birth or death. So to say it another way, the target of liberation or ecofeminist critique of power and injustice is not the indeterminacy of natural selection and pain associated with that, but that which results from human domination or patriarchal oppression. The gospel never aims to take away natural pain and suffering of our created condition. Again, mortality is part of our holiness. But the good news is about the solidarity of God with creatures in our suffering and death, to take away the forsakenness. So, to go to Johnson's examples, does the impala or the pelican chick fear or suffer in the same way that we do? feeling forsaken? Maybe that feeling is a result of sin, the focus on the individual self that would lead to feeling forsaken in that moment of death. Honestly, I don't know, and neither can you. But we do know that deep incarnation is the prelude to deep resurrection. And Johnson writes, "Life in all fullness awaits, unimaginable as it may be. This means that salvation is not the escape of the human experience or the human spirit from an existence embedded in matter, but resurrection of the body, the whole body, person, dust and breath together," she writes on page 208. The Easter Exultet sings to the earth this good news, a promise that the end is revealed. Johnson introduces this idea of the bookends, the ends, the protological and the eschatological claims that are revealed in the middle, in time, in the proleptic life of Christ, and through the means of grace as we experience them today. So in this sense, only can we say creation's evolution has a purpose, a knowable, mysterious, but very real life and love. This is why the Christ event happens, to show us why we were made. That telos, or goal, or purpose of creation, helps us see clearly the difference between God's creating and our acts of making. Because our acts of making comes from matter that already exists, and it always serves some purpose, either instrumental or aesthetic. But God's creation, ex nihilo, is from nothing, and only for love. In this way, the Christian concept of creation is understood against the polarity of the Greeks and the Gnostics, as she points out. It affirms that creation is a good gift of divine freedom. It lives in the promise that we came from love and we will return to love. And in that sense, the bow in the sky is a symbol of that promise for creation itself. In that context, Christ's resurrection is the first installment of that grace for every creature, as Psalm 92 says. So by operating with this concept of atonement, we see more clearly that symmetry between creation and revelation, and the promise that all of creation will participate in this new creation, even John Muir's bear. And those bookends of creatio originalis and creatia nova give meaning to where we are in the creatio continua, in which we participate in life, and all of its pleasure and pain, its agony and its wonder. And so for that, we can say, thanks be to God.